Welcome everybody. My name is Daniel Ibañez. I'm an architect, urbanist, doctor of design, and newly appointed director of the Institute for Advanced Architecture in Catalonia. It is my pleasure to introduce to all of you the annual lecture of the Master in Mass Timber Design that is generously supported by the Softwood Lumber Board. And today we have as a keynote speaker my friend and colleague Nader Tehrani. Before I introduce Nader, I would love to talk very briefly about what is the Master in Mass Timber Design for those of you that are not familiarized, and then I'll introduce our speaker today. So allow me to share my screen for a minute. So as I was mentioning, for those of you that don't know us, we are in the context of the Master in Mass Timber Design, which is a 10-month online education program that is basically focused on training the next generation of architects, of designers and engineers, pretty much with the skills to design and develop and build mass timber buildings, following in a way a very exciting trend that has opened up in recent years thanks to new innovation and new constructions commodity around mass timber. So if I go to the next slide. Give me 1 second here. Yeah, okay, sorry about that. Yeah, so tonight's speaker, for those of us that find ourselves in the European time, it's my very own pleasure to introduce Nader Tehrani. As I was mentioning, he's a good friend and colleague for already many years. Nader, for those of you that don't know him, he's a scholar and practicing architect, currently the dean at the Irwin Chain School of Architecture at the Cooper Union in New York. He was previously a professor of architecture at MIT and previously in Harvard GSD as well. And during his time at MIT, he served as the head of the department, the chair of the architecture department from 2010 until 2014. In the context of this lecture, equally important, he's also the principal of Nader, a practice dedicated to the advancement of design innovation, interdisciplinary collaboration, and intensive dialogue with the construction industry. Nader, I would say, has a truly amazing collection of awards, including 18 Progressive Architecture Awards, being finalist of the 2017 Moriyama Rake International Prize and a nominee for the 2017 Marcus Prize in Architecture. Among many other awards that he has received throughout his career, probably the most important, or for sure one of the most relevant, is for his contributions to architecture and art. Nader has been the recipient of the 2020 Arnold W. Brunner Memorial Prize from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, to which he was also elected as a member of 2021, the highest form of recognition of artistic merit in the United States. So it's a true pleasure to have Nader lecturing for us on topics of around mass timber. His talk is entitled Woodpecker's Delight, where he will address how, in a world of increasingly challenged by global warming, the construction industry today, this shouldn't come as a surprise to most of us, is a major contributor to unsustainable carbon emissions. And as such, how the identification of natural renewable resources is a critical factor in determining a sustainable supply chain for the industry. However, as Nader will articulate in his talk, the role of architecture in this sustainability/industry equation cannot be guaranteed. Therefore, his lecture will focus on the role of wood, adopted in its hybrid formats, to contribute to both the ecological but also the cultural aspects of this equation, to ensure that the architecture plays an important role there. So the last thing I want to quickly mention for those in our audience that are based in the US is that we are super lucky as well to announce or to present to all of you a unique opportunity as well that thanks to the support also of the Softwood Lumber Board. We are happy to announce that we have launched 2 scholarships for those US-based students that would like to join us in the 2nd edition of this online program. So for those of you that are interested in this, please, search it, follow this link. We would love to receive your applications. All right, so without further ado, I hope I'm not forgetting anything important. I want to hand it over to our guest speaker, Nader Tehrani. Last thing I will quickly mention is he's planning to talk for around 45, 50 minutes talk, and then we will have some time for engaging in a conversation with Nader. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nader Tehrani. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniel. Great pleasure to be here amongst you all and back to IAAC, and as well to be able to share some ideas. As I try to share a portion of this screen, let me see if this works. Let's try this. Is this showing? Is my screen showing?
Yeah, we see it perfectly. Thank you, Nader.
All right, beautiful. Again, thank you, Danny, for the introduction. The presentation is basically composed of 3 parts: a very brief introduction, followed by a smattering of different examples that are not all mass timber, but they're all wood, and then followed by our submission for the Venice Biennale. And I believe you've read some articles in anticipation of this presentation, so I may go quite fast through some of the pieces in order to be able to focus on our discussion together. The access to data has revealed a connection between phenomena that is no longer relegated to the relationship between buildings and cities, as the Noli plan shows, but rather building cities and the world itself. Urbanism is now global, as if it never was, and the city as an epiphenomena of another scale that is now measurable beyond what the Annales school could have conjured up some years ago. Here, the data behind the radioactive plume of Fukushima is measured and subsequently visualized in the image on the right, a register of the connection between cities in the Pacific Rim, Tokyo, San Francisco, Valparaiso, on 3 different continents, all share a critical relationship with each other, a reminder that in the age of the Anthropocene, everything local is ultimately global. The emergence of data collection and climate change share a common historical moment. Our ability to shape the environment, that is to destroy it, comes at the same time when our ability to measure it comes with an unprecedented precision, an irony that cannot completely be explained to future generations. In tandem with this, the speed of production is unprecedented. The image of Shenzhen here went from a village to the metropolis in less than 20 years. And that is only one case study. The promise of global urban growth is only getting exponentially higher, and the potential for growth is paralleled by post-industrial labor protocols that have literally made visible the speed of expansion. If you hold a kind of camera down to the city, you can see Phoenix growing by the day. And within this context, there's the question of naturally renewable resources as an alternative to others whose carbon footprint involves a great deal of added impact on the planet. And these don't come with innocent consequences. In fact, global warming and the lack of moisture are, as we speak, are burning up New Mexico. And so how these are managed in tandem with each other is a central part of any discussion around mass timber. Key to this equation is the fact that under the duress of high heat, wood chars while steel melts, as visible in the image to the left. For this reason, there's a real sense that if the building industry may transform from a liability to an asset, if it is able to confront its carbon emissions in tandem with its ability to create policies that allow for unprecedented uses of renewable resources. There are many codes that simply don't comply right now. At the same time, with a calibrated strategy for farming, not only can forestry become sustainable in increasing the volume of trees, but in also providing for a renewable resource for construction, what has led to the mass timber movement and the need for the reevaluation of our building codes, construction practices, and a general outlook towards the environment. So with that, our entry into architecture is from a different generation entirely, and it came through the vessel of language itself. Materiality became a mechanism to gauge the actuality of construction in combination with the syntaxes that it produces. And so whether it's at the scale of furniture or at the scale of large buildings, the kind of examples that I'll try to show demonstrate the agency of wood in its capacity to perform in certain ways. My apologies, my voice is not very good today. I caught a slight cold. In the context of our earlier work, we were working with wood blocks, stacked plywood on the one hand, almost as masonry units, but we were also working with the malleability of plywood, and the idea of plywood as a kind of laminate that is at once solid and malleable gets exposed in the way that in the bookshelf on the left, we can create a moment connection. In the coffee table in the center, the massiveness of the aggregated plywood produces this stability of the wood in compression, while also displaying the suspended shelf underneath in tension below, and then more mysteriously, the shelving system, the drawer system to the right, where the structural system is embedded, concealed within the massive blocks of shelves, almost as masonry units. As this gets translated to the scale of the house here in the Rock Creek house, we try to emulate the structure of the house. You can see in red the parallel lines that essentially run north-south are almost like party wall conditions that are then reinforced by the grain of the furniture and railing systems, essentially all running in the same direction, effectively doing two things. One, allowing the light and the sun to come from the south all the way to the north, but also blanking out the private spaces on the east and the west. And you can see here very delicately behind that stair, a doorway to a master bedroom, which is sliding. Once the door is closed, you don't even see that it's there. This is not just a translation in section, but is part of our research. And that research happens in our own domain. Right underneath where I'm sitting right now is the NAD lab, and the carcasses of the mock-ups of this house are a central part of what we do. So while we're thinking through modeling things, you can see the models in the shelves to the left. The idea of full-scale mock-ups becomes a central part of our research process. But the grain, if you like, the tectonic grain that is produced by some of these structures was my reference to language originally. This is a model of the Mill Road house that was never built, but it conveys the different regional strategies that have been adopted by wood in the Americas, with clapboard siding on the one side and vertical board and batten siding on the other, using their grain to insinuate other possibilities. In the clapboard, the idea of the clapboards rotating up to become shades to create transparency, drawing in the space beyond it. And in the folds of the board and batten, the idea that folding doors could make a similar transparency to the south. The actions that are part and parcel of these tectonics are a central part of our preoccupation. That is, if we can do an architecture that doesn't have hardware, it is because the mechanisms, the elements of that architecture are what are used, or what are adopted in order to do precisely what we're trying to do. Here in the New England house, you can see the way in which the batten is peeled off to become the handle for the garage door that is concealed under this barn building. And so really the language of the part to whole relationship is what we work on. The catalytic detail is what I call it, where you don't yet know what even the house or the building looks like, but you know the kit of parts and their relationship to each other that may be involved. So here in the New Hampshire house, the details were in a way conceptualized in advance, and then they became the vessel through which the container of this large courtyard building would be clad, and ultimately allowing for the framing of an important view through these tectonic elements. And in fact, one inhabits this tectonics as one goes through the ruled surface of the entry condition and the portal. In other conditions, that cladding system is there to bring unity for the addition of another wing onto historic wings here in Beaver Country Day. So in fact, by working on a library, we were able to co-locate all of the different departments together, going from a STEM program with science and arts, science into a STEAM program that includes the arts. And so in the second diagram, the idea of bringing them together comes with the imperative of developing a courtyard, in this case, where the wood elements essentially register the continuity of circulation that hides just behind them, exploding the library, as it were, instead of having a centered library, distributing the library between the sciences, the arts, and the other departments. The shingling then becomes part of the expression of these ramp systems, sometimes going clockwise, other times going counterclockwise. And the skin is a kind of an envelope that is a registration of this. Please look, as I will speak about this a little bit later, that the thinness of that laminate is as powerful to us as is the weight and the thickness in other circumstances. Here, a very, very early exploration of that thinness in the malleability and the pliability of immaterial ultramaterial, where we use the wood as the bottom chord of a bowstring truss that is able to span 20-some feet. As you translate that thinness into the massiveness of mass timber, here you're looking at large LVL girders that essentially are 8 feet deep, spanning some 22 meters, the structure is inverted. In fact, the suspended studios hang from above and over the ground of the main hall. And so the tectonics gets lighter and lighter and lighter as you descend down into the structure. The skylights essentially are a structural space, and contrary to a conventional building that is built from the ground up, where the rustication emerges from the base up, here the massive timber is reserved for the top of the structure with the thin laminar plywood at the bottom. The result of which is essentially a working drawing that builds the building up, suspends it back down, inhabiting spaces of the mass timber at the top, while also revealing the thinness, the acoustic thinness of those same skin conditions at the bottom in the lecture hall at the base. Of course, not all buildings that are mass timber look like it. For the RISD building, the brick became a rhetorical mechanism to connect it not only to this history of the campus, but indeed the history of Providence itself. But the university took a big risk, not only in hiring us, but in asking us to deploy a strategy that was ultimately the greenest strategy that we could imagine, but without getting lead credits for it or any other kind of label. And so the contractors scheduled a 3-month framing period within which we could deploy not a pure mass timber strategy, but actually a hybrid strategy. The hybrid strategy entailed the collaboration of CLT panels in combination with steel I-beams. Why? And the reason for this is simple. Wooden beams would need to be deeper and thicker and are less penetrable for the mechanical systems. And by doing a hybrid system, what we were able to do is to essentially prefabricate the entire building off-site and then just assemble it on-site, leaving no trace of construction on-site. The image you're looking at has no dust. It has no cuts of studs. It has nothing to it. Everything became pre-drilled and pre-cut, and then the light gauge framing was simply inserted into place. The holes you see in the I-beams are then subsequently filled out with the mechanical systems, the sprinkler systems, and so forth. Now, the interesting thing about this story, beyond, if you like, the aesthetics of the wood becoming a protagonist within the architecture, is the idea that if the framing was scheduled for 3 months, it was actually completed in 1 month. And in a project that is IPD, integrated project delivery, it means that the profits were then shared amongst the various members of the designers, the contractors, and the consultants. The pairing up of CLT with other materials instead of steel is also very productive. In the context of the Melbourne School of Design, we were looking for a formwork that would then become part of the embodied presence of that building. So instead of demolishing plywood panels or aluminum panels, taking them apart, the idea was to use the CLT, insert rebar into them, and then put a deck of concrete, the combination of which produces the composite deck that would then become the ground of the atrium that I presented just before. Now, the emphasis on ceilings has been a preoccupation of ours for a long time, if only because of the systems that we have to deal with are really a central part of the architecture of the 20th and 21st century, the hung ceiling. In one of our earliest projects, Mantra became an installation where we were able to manufacture ourselves this hookah den by essentially appropriating the means and methods, reducing the cost of this from $125,000 to $30,000 to redistribute that finance to the rest of the restaurant, as it were. But it was here where we discovered essentially the structural role of timber, its malleability to create space, and probing questions about how it could be used otherwise on larger projects. Some years later, when we were contacted to outfit another restaurant in South Boston that was already built, we realized that all of those systems already existed in the space. Mechanical systems, lighting, all sorts of structural systems were above, and our power was merely just to clad them. And in that cladding, we were able to create a proscenium-like situation whereby the continuity of wood is convincing on one axis, and on the opposite axis, you see the artifice of this strategy looking up into the ceiling where the lighting is, into the wine room, and seeing the laminar condition of the columns as they appear as you walk by them, creating the kind of flexibility that the ground needs for a restaurant. What happens if this were to be conceptualized as a structural strategy rather than a cladding one? And this is the opportunity we got in Dorchester, where we were commissioned to do a single-story library in a local neighborhood that essentially required a new structure. Conceptually, the project revolves around a monumental pitch on the front facade that addresses the main street, while the backside emulates the disaggregation of the houses in the back, producing a hydrological condition where we can save all of the water for the site in a runoff drainage system in the back. We carve out space in the south to bring the sun into the building, taking that mass to the north to frame an existing oak tree, whereby the nature is a central part of this. There are 3 sectors for shelving, for the adults, for the kids, and for the adolescents, but the beams run exposed east-west, and they become the exposed mechanism that is the architecture of this project. It is this that it's the reflected ceiling plan that you experience as a kind of civic covering that allows you to walk through and frame some of the more important spaces of this project. So as a kind of exposed shed, what you're looking at really is acoustic baffles, sprinkler systems, lighting, beams, and then repeat. And this undulation essentially caps each of the study rooms on one side of the plan while leaving the kind of monumental pitch for the great reading room on the opposite side. A similar strategy was used for a house in Connecticut, whereby a simple diagonal on one axis divides the public from the private side. In the poché, as it were, is where the bedrooms, the bathrooms, the kitchens are. And in the opposite diagonal, essentially the structural system that goes in the opposing direction. Here, behind the bookshelves are all of the spaces in black, the dark spaces of the bedrooms, bathrooms, the storage rooms, with a kind of a long lofted area that opens up to the western view. Again, a system that is ostensibly exposed as a raw structure, much like the Adams Library. Conceptually, the idea of this house was to program it in such a way that rooms are dispensed with, but their attributes are not. The living room described by the fireplace, the kitchen by its corollary, counter or dining room, the entry vestibule, essentially with the concealed space of the closets, the library as an extension of the long bookshelf, and finally the bedroom in the final chapter, completely concealed from the rest of the house. Here you see the opposing view and the way that a very modest structure opens up to a double height space on its end, while framing some of the dark spaces laterally and the various attributes. So with this, I take you to the Venice Biennale, which is composed of essentially 5 projects, but they aim to look at the problem of housing. The question of the exhibition was, how will we live together? And we took the question of living together quite literally, with the problem of housing being one of those things that is central not only to the United States, but in many other regions. We looked at urban areas, we looked at suburban areas, we looked at rural areas, and we looked at industrial or post-industrial sectors. And this became an excuse for us to deal with various building types. On the right-hand side, a slab tower. On the left-hand side, a rural villa, which has now become an apartment building. And in the middle, 2 mat buildings that are essentially either dense housing or a combination of work-live spaces. And so I'll try to go through these quite quickly, but that, the timber tower has to do with a challenging of the code with overlapping accommodations. It's located right in my backyard in Boston, and it works with the premise that a lot of urban corridors are already upzoning. And by upzoning, they essentially double their square footage and essentially stack one row house on top of the other, producing what is ostensibly an anomalous condition, like you'll see here on Commonwealth Avenue. But in our case, refashioned, taking what is a legal requirement of 2 means of egress and pairing them up together in the context of a double helical stair. That is one challenge to the code. By bringing them together, you can create a footprint of 2 units that are nested in relationship to each other, using the stair not only for a fire stair, but actually for everyday use going up and down in your own loft, because the loft is 2 floors. What does this mean? It means that the fire stairs are on door openers on a regular everyday basis. And when there's a fire, they close and open only the internal doors. So the units are 2 L units that are nested into each other, with the staircases becoming essentially an extension of the furnishings of that interior, with storage nested right next to them. This is the space that becomes part of the household. The idea of this, of course, is that it's entirely of mass timber, and therefore the entire building is composed of beams running the length of the entire building. So you're looking at the facade with long mass timber elements that are over 60 feet long, and the windows are the result of mere carvings into the bottom face of that create ribbon windows as one looks out from the side views where the workspaces are, where the bedrooms are, and where the kitchens are, leaving the ends for the large living rooms, loft areas, and so forth. And the idea is that this could be essentially structurally erected in less than 3 months. In the context of the suburbs, we're witnessing already a densification and a challenge to the code. And many experiments have been done on this front in the 1950s, 60s. Some of the most interesting ones here in Israel, in Beersheba, in 1959 to 1956. What we adopted this strategy to see what are the densities that we can bring from a conventional 45 units to 240 units. And by nesting various units together around independent courtyards, ensure that everybody has a private garden. And the principle of this is that the circulation of the mat units revolve around one corridor that is the common corridor that tethers you to go down and up from there. So there's one courtyard in the up side and one courtyard in the bottom side for two different units, with the endless corridor in perspective framed by the circle. The upper unit has its own autonomy, and so it gets natural ventilation and natural view to its own courtyard, and the bottom one in a similar way does the same. They have no visual contact with each other, but completely open and porous relationship to their own gardens. In turn, because of their planimetric and sectional distribution, units can be expanded by way of these boardwalks to penetrate each other and become unified in a similar way that we showed in the previous scheme. So you can take 1-bedroom units and pair them up with 2-bedroom units to create 3.5-bedroom units. Some of this then refashions itself in the context of hybrid zoning, where you have Home Depots, Amazons, and other kinds of Costco's, these large supermarket structures that can then be inhabited through a kind of insertion of large-scale mass timber units. This hybrid zoning is already something that's visible in the Route 128 area. And we've looked at various warehouses that are already going under transformation. And their model is really challenging essentially the parking lot as the basis for transportation. Some of these areas are becoming pedestrianized, and that the spaces for parking are becoming structured. New buildings are being inserted in there, and then a new life is born out of the interiors of these warehouses. The warehouses come with their own grids, and one can imagine that one inserts a workspace grid on one axis, and then a live space perpendicular to it. And by doing so, allow the passage of light to come down into the spaces below by carving into them, essentially, and allowing these two modalities of live workspace for artists, for light manufacturing, to coexist together in these spaces. And so a hustle and bustle on the lower level, but then the kind of the respite of the home loft, which is again flexible on the upper levels, which are nested into the roof conditions where you're inhabiting the skylights that look up and look down at the same time. With the loft units essentially being incredibly dense in terms of a strategy that is able to maintain the footprint of the Costco intact. The final one is, of course, the house in the rural area, which is no longer a house, but rather an alibi for introducing density into the rural area, essentially a miniature apartment building. It's called rural density on a very remote site that is not more than 10 minutes from the train station that goes to New York City. So you're in the middle of the countryside. And for people that in the pandemic were needing to go to work, they would go once a week, but spend the rest of the time at home. And essentially the concept is of taking the log cabin and stacking it vertically, for which there are many precedents that we looked at, but essentially they revolved around one simple principle. By using one staircase, one is able to create access to each of the 4 levels, and each 4 levels, the floors are almost identical in their plan. What is important about these 4 levels is that there's no wasted space. Under and over the staircase are where the bedrooms are, the toilets are, the closets are, the showers are. And so the poché, as it were, is fully inhabitable. Within the context of this single stair, one can imagine a single house owned by one family. You can have an in-law live there at the lower level. You can rent one space out, or you can just make it an Airbnb with many different people occupying it. Remembering also that this is both structural and a rain screen at the same time. The stacked CLT is structural, but indeed, once it gets waterproofed and all of that, it's essentially part of a new regime of laminar tectonics, whereby the cladding and all of that does the work of the shedding of water. This is just an excerpt of the article that I imagine that many of you read. But essentially, the cladding is a cloak, a large-scale shingle system that operates, essentially at the scale of a ribbon window that are inserted into key points of the ascent as you come in from the bottom and go to the top. Again, the yellow is the circulation, the red are the bunk beds and the showers. Each floor has only one window, with the corollary windows that are at the landings and in the showers and in critical spaces in the toilet. The ascent from the basement going up, it has its own independent access if required. The front door is actually at a middle level that brings you into a single bedroom unit that is ostensibly independent in terms of its kitchenette and other uses. And the poché spaces are where the bunk beds are here, with a slight window reveal that looks down into the stair. The 2 opposing sides of the same bunk bed here, the stairs looking down with the bunk bed behind it. The bedroom itself, rotated here, is essentially a full micro unit with the bunk beds to the right and the left, the major bed to the center, a large view that looks out, closet, kitchenette in the background. And then as one ascends to a loft area at the top, essentially what we call the living room, again, more bedding up there, but essentially the revelation of the studs on the inner core of this that reveals, in fact, that the CLT couldn't work on its own because the inner layer has a hollow wall within which the mechanical system, the plumbing system, and whatever services are needed are then revealed within that laminar space. Here you can see it, the dividing wall between the bunk bed and the main room are where that sandwich wall happens. And in other words, the CLT, in order for it to be a viable notion, needs to be hybridized with the stud wall in order for them to reinforce each other. Here, the mock-up of that unit in situ, and the entire thing coming together. With this, I will essentially go to only the last chapter, which is the Portico delle Vergini, where we were able to exercise an installation that was a gateway to their gardens. And within the context of this gateway that made reference to the iconographies of Venice, we tried to do a project that was about CLT, carving out of it a grain that was structural. And this structural grain gained its logic by forming structure on the diagonal. Let me see if this works. Let me know if the sound works, but essentially this illustrates the way in which cross-lamination works. It shows you the way in which we carve on the diagonal, bringing out the grain of the cross-lamination in two directions that are then subsequently punctured, penetrated by the columns that connect the deeper section of the canopy as it goes around. Other pieces of other canopies are nested into them on the sides. Obviously, with labor and routing time being exorbitant, so were its costs. And so we needed to go back to the basics. And the basics were, how can we asked ourselves the question, how can we make a gateway out of one plank and the least amount of time cutting? We were looking at the symbol of St. Mark's, Pax tibi Marce Evangelista Meus, the symbol of welcoming to Venice, with a structural system that essentially takes out of one beam and makes in it a foundation, a support, and essentially a cantilevered threshold. The support contains the message of welcoming on its inside, and effectively the gateway straddles one side from the arrival of the boat from the water, demonstrating the absolute and radical limits of the cuts that we were able to ensue onto the plank and install it, of course, in less than a day, with a counterweight to measure its backspan and some steel pieces that would then embed themselves within the context of these laminations to hold them stiff. You're not only holding this up, you're also holding it down from winds and lateral loads. And with that, what I'll do is I'll end and open it up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader. That was beautiful. The floor is open. Please, what I would recommend is, raising probably your hand, or writing in the chat that you would like to make a question, and I'll be calling you guys out so you can intervene. I don't know if anybody has a hand raised. If so, please unmute. Yeah,
I can jump in. Thank you so much for the lecture. Very interesting and beautiful architecture. My background is in development, and I'm wondering how the conversation goes with the developers you may be working with when you're talking about these really ingenious strategies to increase space or the efficiency of the use of space, overlapping uses and so on. How does that go over with the development teams, and what does that look like in terms of the profitability of the project?
It depends how you're asking the question. From the perspective of the use of mass timber, there's a receptivity, because as long as you can do the 1+5 stories, and you're within code, there's a kind of embrace to the idea. In terms of the actual planning strategies that we ourselves have adopted, admittedly, they correspond to an ethos that is far more global and European in terms of the idea of existence minimum. In other words, something I didn't fully articulate in my lecture is that we radically minimize bedroom spaces and other spaces in favor of shared and public spaces. So in what all of these housings contain is an appreciation of collectivity, of how we come together as community, and how we come together as family. So if you follow trends in American development, for instance, you'll know that in today's world, the closets in a master bedroom are often larger than the bedroom itself, because this is the state of culture. What we've designed is for affordable housing for a completely different ethic. Now, that doesn't mean that you couldn't use it for the development culture that you think of, but the problem with the US right now is that there isn't enough affordable housing, and our goal was to address that middle level, people that can afford a house but want to redistribute their investment within the question of buying a house. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Nader. Pablo, go ahead.
Hi, Nader. Nice. Thank you so much for the talk. Super interesting. My question was more directed towards fabrication and understanding what your process of designing is. When you get a project, how do you begin designing? Do you reach out to the community to try to understand what their needs are? And then once you're in the studio, are you jumping from digital to prototyping at a certain scale? You talked a little bit about models, but I was more interested to know if there was at any point where you guys did one-to-one prototyping, which I know is now becoming more common in the office. Thank you.
The simple answer is yes, yes, and yes. The beginning of a project is by necessity messy. So what it entails is that you are working very closely with constituencies, client groups, depending on their complexity, meeting with more than one group at a time. You're meeting with city agencies because there are urban issues at stake, and sometimes zoning cannot be taken for granted. You can actually apply for variances that are better than what the code or the zoning entails. But at the same time, you're doing basic planning and typological studies that when things go right, involve an inventive moment that you can mock up immediately. And so we are working almost in tandem on 5 different routes at the same time, trying to use schematic design as a litmus test for speculative and projective ideas. And when we succeed, it means that the added work that we did up front made sense, because obviously we don't build all of these buildings. There's major contractors at work. So some of that investment that we're putting into it needs to find its logic back into the contractor's hand or into the sub trades in some way or another. So essentially what I'm saying is that we're not working linearly. We're working with parallel strands and seeing in that mashup which logic wins or has the most persuasive argument.
Gotcha. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you, Nader. Sobi, go ahead.
Hi, Nader. Thank you for the presentation. My name is Subhi, and I'm doing the Master in Mass Timber from Vancouver. And my question is about the project, about the 2 stairs overlapping and the means of egress. It caught my attention. Can you elaborate a little bit more of what the challenge was and how it was resolved? I felt like it was a little bit fast. and how, because usually two means of egress means the whole floor should be accessed by the two means of egress. But in the project, it was like if every unit had one mean of egress. If you can elaborate a little bit more.
Yes, I can. And to do that, sorry, I would need to share the screen again. And let me see if I can.
And also about any, I don't know if you went into detail about like fire protection, because the two stairs are kind of like sharing a wall.
Yeah, I'm trying to annotate. Where's my annotation? How come I can't find annotation? I can't find the annotation right now.
Kaya, if you can allow Nader to annotate, I think you have to give him rights.
I actually was kicked out of the meeting because of my internet. So I think Alicia's gonna have to do that from the.
Okay. Here's what I'm gonna do. In a typical unit, you need two means of egress, one this way and one this way. And on the opposite side, this way and this way. And both of those are straddling two different levels, right? But the key to this is that there's a sliding door here and here that needs to remain locked on an everyday basis. So the doors that are inside your unit are remaining open on an opener, as it were. The two sliders are unlocked here. When there's a fire, the door closers here close immediately and the sliders slide back, and that this becomes one continuous loop that goes down like this. And then the distance from your diagonals are minimal. These are not large units, but essentially bring you to your two means of egress within the core of the building. The elevator is here to the side. This is, I don't know if this is convincing or not. This is a fact of speculation, I would say. This is, we didn't take it, all the way through code consultants and things like that. But the prospect of doing a double helical stair is not new. It's something that we have all seen before. The question of how to do it under these circumstances means that the net to gross area of the building is radically efficient.
Yeah, that answers it. Thank you.
Thank you, Subi. Thank you, Nader. Essing, go ahead.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. I have two questions, and one is I'd like to know maybe a little bit more about like the earlier part of your career and like how you've improved yourself over the years, because honestly, this is really genuinely a question and more than a compliment, but I feel like it's really hard to specialize in, like, for example, even in one material, but I see that you have specialized and, you're an academic, but you're also a professional architect and you design in various scales. And how do you do that? And how did you get good at it, kind of? And then my second question will be about authenticity. Then this came to my mind after seeing your work, Bank, I think, if I'm pronouncing it right. And I remember Wood City in Helsinki. I don't know if you've ever seen that project. It's new, so it was done after yours. But the lobby part of that project reminded me a lot of yours. And after also reading your article on the blank speculations on CLT, you define like what architects do and how many kind of difficult, what conundrum we're in. But do you think authenticity is also one of them? Like, is that like a motivation for you to be authentic? Or what do you feel when you see something like what I said in that example, when you see maybe someone did something very similar to what you've done before?
Yeah, so there's two questions packed in there. One is about my trajectory, and my trajectory is relatively simple. I did absolutely no work in high school and got accepted nowhere except for RISD on deferral, basically. And I started studying for the first time at RISD. And then I fell in love with, design, because it was a kind of alternative language than the literary one. The visual language became a mechanism to produce knowledge, what I couldn't do with words. It was an incredible experience, RISD, but it was disaggregated very much because there's freshman foundation in the arts. Then you enter into the foundation period of the architecture program in the sophomore year. Then I went to Italy for 1 year and did film, and I did other things in Rome. And then I came back and I panicked because I didn't know anything about architecture. So fourth year was another foundation for me. And then there was thesis. And so I felt somehow lacking in education, and didn't know anything about how to put a building together nor anything. So I applied to the AA for the history and theory program, where we read 2 books a week and wrote 2 papers a week. And that became a kind of compensatory year for all of the things I hadn't done at RISD. Then after 2 years of work for an office of insignificance, I learned how to build. I was, the lowest ranking member of a team designing a McMansion in Hyannisport, and the lack of ownership and authorship over this allowed me to learn some really basic techniques of wood construction, traditional wood construction. At that point, I was at an age where I had to really own what I'm going to do and how I'm going to do it. And I wanted to go back to school, but not in architecture, but in urbanism. So the shift in scale is explained there in urbanism. Now, all of this is to say is that, like you or like anybody else, one goes through a moment in history, a personal moment with your strengths and weaknesses, and you land somewhere. I landed in a place where I was looking around me at students who were doing extraordinary work, but in ways that I had not yet achieved. And so the single question I asked myself upon graduation from Harvard was, why is it that everybody is designing and theorizing philosophy, theory, all sorts of conceptual ideas, but the idea of building technologies is completely absent in those questions? And why is it that building technologies is always a course that is saddlebagged to the side? And the beginnings of our material explorations, from the installation at MoMA all the way to immaterial, ultramaterial, to some of the more recent stuff at the Biennale, are an acknowledgement that the means and methods of construction are not something that is relegated to a trade down the road. If we don't own it, conceptually, I mean, we stand to lose the agency of architecture altogether. So, and that's also a response to your question about the proliferation of materials. Once you ask a question about a material, how it aggregates, how it distributes, and how it becomes an intelligent detail, then it has the capacity to expand into many projects. And by the way, not just your project, other people can borrow from it and make it their own, which is fair. And this is a good bridge to your second question about authenticity. As you well know, architecture is a cultural practice. What it means is that we don't own typologies, we work with typologies. There are building configurations, organizations, details, and scenarios that we constantly borrow from history and readapt and make new again. Every once in a while, somebody out there invents something completely new and it sets new precedents. And you're absolutely right about that. There's something absolutely original about that, but it's rare and far between. So I would say that the majority of our work is lodged in the area of transformation, not pure invention. Then you're talking about social media, even though you never said that word. We did bank at an opportune moment, which is a rather simplistic project that I like to disown from time to time. But it was at a moment when social media was really taking off. When we won that, when we completed that project, we published it. It was awarded more than any other project we'd ever done. And immediately it went viral. And then we started seeing versions of it in Vietnam, in Poland, in Australia, in South Africa, in all parts of the world. And you have to ask yourself, is this being copied, or is this really, it's developed itself as a genre in itself? So I don't know about authenticity. I know that you have to recalibrate your sense of ownership with new media at this point. But I think the safest platform to start your question with is the idea that we work with shared knowledge 99.9% of the time. What we bring to it is particular onto this site, this situation, and this scenario.
Thank you, Nader. Thank you, Yasin. Thank you. Natalie, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Nader, for this lecture. I wanted to ask a question more in regards to the article Blank Shot, I believe it's called, in which you speak about that there's a divorce into the notions of what design intent and the means and methods. So basically, like, you know, you have your architect that's designing and the other part that is building. So you said that you were able to achieve, or well, kind of like have this shared platform in which both of these trades or professions kind of like work better together. So I wanted to, if you could talk a little bit more about that, and or if you see the potential of now this role being redefined, not just us as architects, but also these trades also being like brought up to a higher level in design, which would like, for mass timber, we would have to redefine these roles.
I should clarify that my reference to design intent and means and methods is an American idea, North American idea. In the AIA, in the AIA contract, they describe design intent as part of the ownership and responsibility of the architect. But the exact means and methods of how that's to be translated into construction, that of the contractor. And what does that really mean to you and me? It means that the detail, the ethics, if you like, Essen's term, authenticity, if you want the ethic of that detail to be articulated exactly as is, they rob that from you because they can basically paint it on. Now, that doesn't mean they can literally paint it on, but it means they can argue for that. They can argue that if it looks like what your drawing is claiming, then it's producing its circumstances. You can build a building out of steel and put a wood veneer on it and say it's mass timber, which we know it can't. So understanding the means and methods is twofold. It's a tool of war when everything is resisting you, and it's the best tool of collaboration and intellectual empathy for us as architects to step into the trades of a woodworker, a metal worker, and a glass worker. And we've done all of the above. In the context of the hookah dome in Mantra, we were at war. We had a budget of, I don't remember now, $150,000 for the entire restaurant, and the dome came out at $125,000, leaving us, a couple dozen $1,000s for the rest of the restaurant. It was impossible. We were kids. We had no idea how pricing works. We had no idea how construction systems work. So we had to develop a construction system ourselves. So we did the mock-up, by hanging plumb bobs from the ceiling down, and we did 7 layers in one day. And we said, well, if we can do this in one day, we can do the entire thing in 30 days at $1,000 a day and still make a profit. Why is the guy asking 125 over 30? Because that is what the construction industry excels at. If they know that you don't know how to build something, they also know how to rig the prices. They know how to make things more complicated when they're simple, and they know how to own the process. So I think it's a political question what you're asking. Our ability to reclaim territories of construction is a central part of, I would say, the discipline of design rather than the discipline of construction alone. How to get there, of course, is complicated because you have to use the AIA as a platform for that battle. You can use the digital design process as part of it because the shop drawing process is done much more organically within your BIM model. And there are many other mechanisms that do that. I think construction practices as we speak have changed already since the early days when Frank Gehry was taking on new challenges like this. But it remains to be honest with you, I use means and methods as a metaphor now for everything. In other words, when you are doing something that another discipline would normally do, you have to understand what is irreducible about what they do. So if you're going to go into the environmental sciences, you have to understand how biology works in order to understand what is it about the quality of the water that needs to be sustained in a certain project, for instance. And you can't outsource everything. Even if you have a consultant, you have to learn their language rather than them coming into your language. And that was my message about that.
Thank you very much.
Beautiful. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Nader. I think we have Alexandros next.
Yeah, hello, Nader. Thank you for the presentation. I'd like to ask you the following. In your presentation, as well as in your, let's say, topics regarding monolithic desires and about how to go back to, let's say, more primitive things like architectures and like the Gothenburg Caribbean hut that you have already in the blank shots, as well as Biennale, you are always referring to something like tracing back to our, let's say, primitivism or history or something to create something new through technology. So my main question is, because carpenters, let's say, was always with, let's say, architects, engineers, and closely creating something with good on all these years, how this comes to our age. It is like a digital carpenter. It's like that we have as architects to design something and then to CNC it on the manufacturing. And what's the role of the carpenter / architect / designer in our age, according to your thoughts?
Please correct me as I go in case I've misunderstood your question, because I'm not sure if I completely was able to locate it, but I'll go one step at a time. My reference to history and archaic forms is really a cultural one. In other words, they're not a reliance on old archaic buildings. Actually, I'm interested in the relationship between, pre-modern structures, modern structures, and contemporary structures. I like to see dialogue across ages and across thinking or intellectual modalities. What I also like is when these modalities come into conjunction with each other. So something that I like about the archaic is what I like about Alejandro Aravena's chair, that belt. It's just like the most rudimentary question about how you support your back and how you sit in repose. That old structures had to ask some really rudimentary questions about the nature of a building. And as you look at buildings around us today that A, are designed to survive 20 to 30 years, and B, often their mark of significance and efficiency is their mechanical system, not their natural ventilation, you begin to question what is it that we're actually doing? Some 2-3 years ago, I had the unfortunate occasion of being stuck in Worcester, and I had to go for a night there and stay in a hotel. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't open the window because the building was designed with HVAC or nothing. And that form of incarceration for me was an indication when the legal system or the cultural system around architecture has done something against us, when it ensures that we cannot breathe natural air. And so in bringing contemporary technologies, whether it is CNC routing or whether it is artificial intelligence or whether it is other forms of hybrid collaborations, my hope is to bring what you call the archaic, but I've also termed as existence minimum, into dialogue with state-of-the-art technologies, and from an ethical point of view, use technologies as the backup system of the planet, not the forefront system. Now, I don't know, have I actually answered your question or not?
Yeah, sure. So according to this, what do you think is the role of the new carpenter? I mean, the new carpenter, instead of, are we working with hands now or with robotics? I mean, are we working with, what's the replacement?
Both. I think that the best carpenter is the one who knows both. And I'll tell you that there is no model that we've built out there in my gallery that is not the product of hand and digital together, because these composite systems end up doing things for each other that the other cannot do. And so I don't have as much experience with trades in the way that I should, because we haven't built that much, but the best of them have this capacity to work on both modalities. And by the way, I should say this about pedagogies also. I mean, one of the hugest fears at Cooper Union was that I was going to come there and eliminate hand drawing. And I said, no, why? You should learn to draw by hand, you should learn to compute, and you should learn to work with Rhino, because these are 3 different intellectual practices. And technically they allow you to do 3 different things. And the metaphor I used for that is, the problem of getting around a lake. You can learn how to ride a bike around the lake, but that doesn't guarantee that you can swim back. And that we're in the business of teaching you how to swim and bike at the same time. And I think that some of the most interesting things that we're seeing in the world are probably not in the US right now, but are in other places like Mexico, China, Iran, places that find themselves somewhere between, medieval trades on the one hand and state-of-the-art technology on the other. And the way that they bring them together in conversation is ingenious.
Thank you, Alexandros. Thank you, Nader. I think we have maybe time for a couple of questions more, 3. So Rank Bar, sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly, please go ahead.
Do you hear my voice?
We do.
We hear you, we don't see you, but we hear you.
Yes, it's all right. Thank you. I'm actually an architecture student from Iran, and it's really an opportunity to ask directly. So since I'm a student and you're a professional, my question is, how do you merge different phases of a project? I mean, the idea phase and given concepts and that phase of construction. Do you see, or did you saw construction phase like a limitation of your ideas, or absolutely not? Actually, it was actually the opportunity to give greater ideas, especially when you were doing your first projects, or maybe when you're starting a new project. And besides that, how do you see the practice of conceptual ideas for a real project? Thank you.
I didn't understand the second question. What was the second question?
I actually asked you, how do you see practicing conceptual ideas and like participating in competitions is going to help through understanding more about real projects? Are there going to be a help, or maybe we should focus more about details, real details?
Okay, so the first question first. The role of construction is very different depending on what continent and which culture you're in. In Japan, the contractors play a central role in drawing up the project, as they did for the Yokohama port terminal for foreign office architects. And they become a central advocate for the project by redrawing it up. In the US, the phases of the project are called schematic design, and design development, then construction documentation, then there's bidding and negotiations, and then there's construction administration at the end. It is very common for ideas to be developed from schematic design all the way through the end of design development without any mock-ups, without any significant understanding of the construction system. And then this phase called value engineering, which is essentially cutting and slicing the design into 10 halves and eliminating the design in that phase before you go into the construction documentation phase. Because of the VE phase, because of the value engineering phase, we realized that if you want to insert proof of concept into your thinking, you need to model at full scale some of these ideas of collaborations with trades upfront in ST. There are few budgets that allow for this, a few clients that allow for this, but if you take it on as your charge, it is possible in some way or another to be able to do some of the kinds of things we've done in order to front load them. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Now,
yes, you actually gave me how the phases of building a real project in America is.
That's correct. That too. Now, in terms of your question about conceptual ideas, I don't see real projects and unbuilt projects as different.
Really?
Well, architecture is about ideas. It's about conceptual ideas, whether built or unbuilt. And so I guess the only way I would articulate the question differently is that, there are great ideas and there's some less than great ideas. But the ideas are everywhere. They're in the construction systems, they are in the organization of cities, they are in ways in which we will live together. And the ideas, without ideas, there's no architecture. I mean, I suppose there's a world of just building, but just building is not an idea, is not sufficient. So for me, the moment that architecture is in evidence is when it rises to the occasion of self-consciousness. And that self-consciousness is a conceptual moment.
All right, so you see higher value for built projects than
Obviously, I do, in the sense that I'm thirsty to build, but some of the
That's right.
best projects in the world remain unbuilt. I
That's
mean,
just
think
absolutely right.
think of the Jussieu Library. You know, it's a project that we reference time and time and time again, and conceptually, it's much more pure than the Seattle Library, and yet, you know, we're destined to refer to it as an unbuilt project. It doesn't make it less potent, does it?
No.
Okay, so thank you so much
Thank
for the
you.
question. Thank you, Nader. I think we have time for maybe one more question. So Irfan, if you can unmute yourself and show us your face and ask a question, that would be great. Irfan, we cannot hear you. You there?
Can you hear me?
I think so.
Can you hear me? Let me.
Yep, we heard
Is
you.
it better now?
Yep.
Hi, Nader. Thanks for your time. I'm Irfan. I'm studying architecture in Isfahan, in Iran. And yeah, the affordability part you've mentioned earlier got my attention because I see a lack of diversity in use of material in Iran. And it is becoming more and more kind of a problem. And especially wood as a material for building such large projects is known as an expensive material. And I wanted to ask you about what are the really main parameters and aspects that define your projects affordable and can go further than what is common and what is not common in country or area.
Well, I'm not sure if I understood your question correctly, but let's start by saying that wood is less affordable in Iran because we are described by desert primarily. And so we have some wood up in the north by the Caspian, but effectively, we don't have that as a natural resource. And so wood would have to be brought in, you know, from Russia, from Scandinavia, and from other places. And that really undoes the principle right up front, which is, by the way, the same reason why the earth is the best form of tectonics historically in Iran. That comes in the form of bricks. It comes in the form of adobe and you know, other renditions of rammed earth that are not equatable to what they call rammed earth in the US today. But these are the technologies that we historically used. And if you note, there are some wood beams in the Kogel houses, but they're few and far between, and they're essentially the trunk of the tree used raw. So I guess I would ask you that question. I mean, what are the construction systems that are right there at your feet that make the most sense? On a sloped site, there's just earth. To build a house or to build a building, you need a level floor. There's a difference in building above the ground, building in the ground, or building partially in the ground, because the redistribution of earth has a radical impact on that site. That's why the balanced cut to fill relationship has such prominence as a sustainable landscape strategy. And these are logics that, yes, admittedly are archaic, but still maintain a kind of power today. So yes, I would say, and this is a response to an earlier question about somebody, I think it was Essen, asking us, you know, that we work in so many different materials and all of that. Well, it's not we that are working in so many materials. If you ask the question about the resources that are available to a site and the cultural practices that come from that site and the sort of expenses that are wrought as a result of it, they usually lead you to much more local practices, which, by the way, is not always true. I mean, the Adams Library terracotta was really slated for a terracotta from New England, and it was a great terracotta. And some company in Spain underpriced their thing in the middle of the pandemic, and all of the terracotta comes from Spain. It's completely irrational in my mind, and yet that is another logic. But it's a logic that I would have, if I were the head of the library systems, I would have rejected that. I would have paid the extra money to go local, and I would have deleted some of the tiles somewhere. I would have been willing to do that rather than bring it from Spain, because the carbon footprint that it requires to come there. But we had no power to say that. But I think, Erfan, I think your question is a broader question. It has to do with not just the ecology of design, but the ecology of practice, and how its shared ethics need to do something larger than what we can do at the design table.
Yeah, actually, I'm going to learn more about RAMNERF, and I'm participating in a workshop that, you're correct about use of material. But as I said, I wanted you to tell me about some parameters that can go further than materials. You've said that earth is more known material as a.
Irfan, let me cut you there. One question I think was good. Sorry to cut you off, but we're running out of time, and I want to make sure that I can properly thank you, Nader, before we have to go. Thank you for your question again. So let me wrap it up there. Nader, as always, I equally enjoy your build work, your unbuilt work, your talks, and also the discussions that we have afterwards. Truly inspirational. I think they resonate very, very well with many of the discussions that we are having these days as part of the master in mass timber design. We say that, you know, it's not enough just to bring a new player on the game, a sustainable ecological player, but really, you know, making sure that the architecture plays a huge role in that new balance and that new equation. I want to highlight two things that I appreciate the most about the talk as a way of summarizing and wrap it up. This kind of idea that you are leaving us with about the kind of monomateriality, try to start thinking what makes the most sense, but also in a kind of synthetic kind of like way. And this does not mean renouncing on intensity of design. One of the things that your work shows the most is that there is a relentless emphasis on adding value to any scale, and the project never seems to be finished. It's always one step that you can go forward in scale or in kind of like definition, which is kind of beautiful. And then the second one, which I think you have highlighted several times throughout the talk today, of really, combining those two worlds of the design, the ideas, the concept, with the means and methods. And, maybe this is less of an issue for those that we have been trained under the kind of polytechnic kind of paradigm, which maybe is more means and methods and maybe less of the design ideas and concept. But I think really it's about putting the two together that, could move us to the next level. So,
I should say something, Daniel. It's something that you just reminded me of. Sometimes when I talk about means and methods, people think that I go downstairs and I work with wood with my own hands. And I try to clarify with everybody, I've actually never built anything myself, not once. And I don't hold that as a point of pride, but this is what maybe distinguishes between means and methods as a conceptual idea rather than hard labor. And so, but in order for the conceptual idea to come to terms with the idea of hard labor, you have to understand through intellectual empathy what is it that is actually being done out there.
Completely, but my point is not only on the labor question and the making with your own hands, but really incorporating the tectonical, the structural, the performative, not as a kind of technical requirement of or something that you need to fulfill, but really as drivers of the design, not at the expense of those ideas, but in combination with. And I think again, your work truly shows that throughout the scale, throughout interventions, and for us that's really one of the reasons why it was a true pleasure to have you with us. So again, hopefully this generation of new architects that we are hoping to train and to provide this expertise will follow your lead in many levels. But again, I want to thank you and thank the Softwood Lumber to make this this hour and a half possible, and really enjoying the conversation. Thank you to all the students for the active participation, and everybody else that joined us from thousands of locations around the world to watch and hear Nader. So to be continued. Thank you so much, Nader, again, and thank you all.
Thank you so much. Really wonderful being here. Bye-bye.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.